everyone, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you're new here. I'm Andrea.M. if you don't know me already, and this is Real Crime International. And I'm excited to say that today as it marks the beginning of our new segment where we start branching out to uncover what lurks beneath the entire globe as a whole. But before we begin, can I please ask you to consider subscribing to the channel? I'm still trying to get to my first 1,000 subscribers. I'm almost nearly halfway there, so to everybody who's subscribed already, thank you all so much. It means the world to me and it helps me out a ton. Also, I have had a bit of feedback from some people. They're like, oh, what does subscribe mean? Do we have to pay anything? No, you don't. Subscribing to channels on YouTube is totally free. What you may be a little bit confused with is some of the YouTubers on here will mention channel memberships. Well, I can't get that until I get to my first 1,000 subscribers. And you don't have to sign up for a channel membership if you don't want to. You can just stay a subscriber. There are many channels on here I would love to sign up as a member to or to their Patreons, and I just don't have the money right now. So I stay a faithful subscriber. So that's how you can help me get to that stage if you subscribe. Also, if you drop a nice comment in the comment section below or what you thought of the case, or if you have a suggestion for a future case that you would love me to cover here on the channel, please suggest away because I love it when my subscribers make suggestions and it helps me to know what you guys would like to see here. So, with all that being said, let's begin. And today we are leaving Australia. We are packing our bags for one of the most famous and beautiful locations in the USA, Long Island. Long Island is known for its stunning stretch of coastline, landmass, and as a vacation destination for thousands of US citizens every year. It's not without its own share of some pretty dark events, however. Today we will be looking at the case of the Long Island serial killer, or killers, whatever the case may be. It is also more commonly known as the Gilgo Beach serial killings. So get comfy, grab a blanket and a drink or a snack. I promise you can snack to this one, okay? It's not like last week's case. As we explore one of the USA's still most baffling cases. So for a little clarity on Long Island, for those of you who don't know much about it, Long Island is a densely populated island in southeastern New York, and it constitutes a significant share of the New York metropolitan area in terms of both population and land area. With over 8 million inhabitants as of 2020, it is the most populous island in the United States and the 18th most populous island in the world. The island extends from New York Harbour, 118 miles or 190 kilometres for those still here in Oz, eastward into the North Atlantic Ocean, with a maximum north-south width of 23 miles, which is around 37 kilometres. With a land area of 1,401 square miles, which is 3,630 square kilometres if you're interested, it is the largest island in the contiguous United States. The Native Americans also have a name for Long Island, and the Long Island name is Paumanok, meaning the island that pays tribute. More powerful tribes in the surrounding areas, once this is back in the day, forced the relatively peaceful Long Islanders to give tributes as payment to avoid attacks by them. Long Island is also famous for the Montauk Point Lighthouse, the Unisphere, which is a large metal globe sculpture, the Brooklyn Bridge, and I think we're all familiar with that one, Coney Island, and they do have their very own Luna Park, and that is situated, of course, at Coney Island. There is also a Chinatown filled with Chinese markets and restaurants. There is another borough called Flushing, which is home to a stone castle with gardens known as Hempstead House. It is also home to JFK International Airport. It also boasts wine country vineyards, a college museum building at Stony Brook University. It is also home to the Robert Moses Water Tower and Robert Moses State Park. Long Island is divided into 4 counties, with Kings, also known as Brooklyn, Queens and Nassau occupying its western third and Suffolk its eastern 2/3. As of 2020, more than half, which is about 58.4%, of New York City residents live on Long Island and in the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens. Although in common parlance, the term Long Island, or locally the island, actually refers exclusively to the counties of Nassau and Suffolk. Conversely, locally the term the city refers to Manhattan alone. So that's a little bit about Long Island if you're not familiar with it. But the location of today's case actually takes place in Gilgo Beach, Long Island, and that is in Babylon County. And it is about an hour and 10 minutes away from New York City. And this idyllic beachside community was thrust into the headlines after the body of a young woman was found on the exit ramp for the Robert Moses Causeway, and that is situated on Ocean Parkway. As more bodies were being discovered in the months following the first victim, the police began to realise there was a pattern emerging here. They had a serial killer on their hands. The murders of 11 young women between 1996 and 2011 would soon become known, as I mentioned a minute ago, as the Gilgo Beach serial murders. So what were the Gilgo Beach serial murders? They were a series of killings between 1996 and 2011, and that is those that we know of, in which the remains of 11 people were found in Gilgo Beach, located on the south shore of Long Island, New York, United States. Most of the known victims were sex workers who advertised on Craigslist. And I think there was actually a movie made about this. Now, I'm not sure if it was called a Craigslist killer or if it was called the Long Island serial killer. But there is a movie based on this, and I have watched it, and that's why I've kind of done this case as my first international one, because there is one component of this case that really hit me pretty much in the feels, and you'll know it when I get to it. And it is a huge twist in this case as well. There are a few in this case, so yeah, get comfortable and be ready. So the perpetrator in the case is known as the Long Island serial killer, or LISK. And it is known as the Gilgo Beach serial killings, as we just said. So at the moment, as of last year, we do have a suspect in custody, and I will talk about him shortly. The problem with this is the suspect in custody has only been charged with 4 of the victims that have been found at Gilgo Beach. And as you can see, there is at least 6 or 7 more that he has not been charged with. And as the case rolls along, you'll kind of get the feeling that maybe there might have been more than one person, or did they in fact maybe even arrest the wrong person? Does happen in these cases. It's just things to think about, and he is still entitled to a trial by jury where he is found innocent until proven guilty. So just keep that in mind as the case progresses. It's, as I said, it's twisted and there is a lot to it, so definitely get comfortable, have provisions, and let's just get on into it. I'll stop blathering on. But I just wanted to just put that out there before we get too deeply into the case, because there's so many twists and turns, it does get a little bit confusing, even for me presenting it. So anyway, let's proceed. So the victims' remains were found over a period of months in 2010 and 2011, and this happened after the disappearance of a woman named Shannon Gilbert, and it resulted in a police search of the area along the Ocean Parkway near the remote beach towns of Gilgo and Oak Beach in Suffolk County. So the remains of 4 victims that were designated the Gilgo 4 were found within a quarter mile of each other near Gilgo Beach in December of 2010. There were 6 more sets of remains found in March and April of 2011 in Suffolk and Nassau counties. So the police believe the latter sets of the remains predate the 4 bodies that were found in December of 2010. So the girl they were originally searching for, Shannon Gilbert, her remains were actually found more than a year after the remains of the Gilgo 4 were discovered. Her cause of death still remains contested, with police claiming an accidental drowning, while an independent autopsy at the order of the family was also done, and it actually determined that Shannon may have possibly been strangled. So there's an argument going on there. So what happened last year that I touched on briefly was in July of last year, a man named Rex Heuermann, a resident of Massapequa Park on Long Island, was actually arrested in Midtown Manhattan and charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo 4 victims, and they were Megan Waterman, Melissa Barthelemy, and Amber Costello. He is also named as the prime suspect in the murder of the 4th of the Gilgo 4, Maureen Brainard Barnes. So I'll get to how they sort of arrested and captured him as the case progresses. So the first of the human remains, the first discovery, was made by the side of Ocean Parkway in Oak Beach on December 11 of 2010. And the investigation was prompted, as we said before, by the search for 24-year-old Shannon Gilbert, who had disappeared in that area in May. And this was actually after she was fleeing. She was also a sex worker, and she was fleeing from a client's home. She actually made a 23-minute long emergency 911 call, and she was screaming to the dispatch officer that they're trying to kill me, they're trying to kill me. And then she ran into the night and disappeared. And a month after her disappearance, the Suffolk County Police Department's Missing Persons Bureau asked John Malaya, one of their officers, to search for Gilbert with his trained cadaver dog, a German Shepherd named Blue. So over the course of the summer 2010, Malaya unsuccessfully searched the gated beach community where Gilbert had last been seen. So I'm wondering why it actually took them so long to search for this girl. Okay, granted, she was a sex worker and I think she was homeless at the time she went missing, but she was still in contact with her mother, and her mother knew she was missing. So the officer made a new attempt at a search on December 11 of 2010. This time he stayed close to the shoulder of the parkway, and Malaya based the choice of search area on FBI data indicating that dump bodies are frequently found close to roadways, and we have seen this in other cases before. So despite the thick vegetation and a light layer of snow, the dog actually alerted to a scent, and Malaya and the dog tracked the scent to a skeleton that was disintegrating in a burlap bag. And the remains were later identified as Melissa Barthelemy. They weren't actually Shannon's remains. So the police discovered 3 additional bodies while searching the scene for further evidence, and at this time they were still searching for Shannon. So the bodies of the 4 victims, as we named before, if you want to hear them again, was Maureen Brainard, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. And they were found approximately 500 feet or 150 metres from each other. In March of 2011, the partial remains of another woman named Jessica Taylor were found along Ocean Parkway. 8 years earlier, in 2003, other parts of Taylor's remains had been found in Manorville, a town in Suffolk County. The next month, in April 2011, police discovered 3 additional sets of remains, and this is a very, very sad part of the case. So, it was an unidentified female toddler, an unidentified Asian person, and Valerie Mack, partial remains of whom those like Jessica Taylor had been found in Manorville years earlier in November 2000. 2 more bodies were found in Nassau County, and these ladies were Karen Vergata, whose partial remains had previously been found on Fire Island in 1996, and an unidentified woman with a distinctive tattoo of peaches, and she was sadly later found to be the actual mother of the little unidentified toddler baby girl that was found in Suffolk County. So that's a really sad twist to this case. So on May 9, 2011, police speculated that because of the similarities in the cases, Valerie Mack, who at the time was unidentified, and Jessica Taylor may have been murdered by a second separate killer. On November 29, 2011, police announced that they believed that there was only one person to be responsible for all 10 murders, and that the perpetrator is almost certainly a resident of Long Island. So the single killer theory stems from common characteristics between the condition of the remains and the forensic evidence related to the bodies. In June of 2011, Suffolk County Police announced a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in the Long Island murders. And finally, Shannon Gilbert's remains were located in Oak Beach in December of 2011. This was 19 months after Shannon disappeared, and as we said before, the cause of death is still contested. They're not sure if she drowned or if she was strangled. For my money, and from watching the video, the movie, my bet would be on strangulation, to be honest. So the FBI became involved on December 10, 2015, and the Suffolk County Police Commissioner Tim Sinney announced the FBI had finally joined the investigation officially. The announcement came one day after a former police chief, James Burke, was actually indicted for civil rights violations and conspiracy. So this becomes very interesting for me, and probably for most of you as well. As you'll remember, some of the cases, especially the ones that I covered from the 1970s here in Australia, there was a lot of police corruption going on, evidence tampering, that kind of thing. It isn't endemic to Australia. It happens everywhere, and this is what was going on in this case with this Burke. So Burke, who resigned from the department in October of 2015, was reported to have repeatedly blocked FBI involvement in the Gilgo Beach case, and he did it for years. The FBI had previously assisted in the search for victims, but had never officially been a part of the investigation. In November of 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for assault and conspiracy. There was considerable other interagency friction and failures to cooperate in law enforcement that hindered the investigation over the years. Now, the other thing here is it hasn't been made clear why Burke did this. My thoughts, and this is just my thoughts on it, was he being paid to tamper with evidence? Is one of the perpetrators somebody who's involved in law enforcement or of one of the wealthy families living around the area? Because unfortunately, you get a lot of organised crime in areas like this where there are a lot of wealthy people. There have even been speculation that the mafia can be tied to parts of Long Island, that there could be organised crime, and he may have been paid off in that kind of a situation, or maybe he knew the killer personally and he was trying to stop whoever it was going to prison for their crimes. That's just a speculation, and I think it's really interesting because what motivation would this police officer have had to hinder the investigation? So I'm finding that component of it really interesting as well. So in January, and it was January 16 of 2020, the Suffolk County Police Commissioner Geraldine Hart finally released images of a belt found at the crime scene with the letters HM or HW, depending on the orientation of the belt, embossed in black leather. So before this, the police had sort of been keeping all of the evidence, etc., that they had found to themselves, probably because they didn't want to alert the killer that they were onto them. But as no leads were sort of coming up, I think it was like, okay, we have to let something out to try and see if anybody knows who this person is or who owns this belt. I mean, because not only might the belt have belonged to the killer, it could have belonged to another victim. So they've released the evidence of this belt. So the belt had been found during the initial investigation near Ocean Parkway in Gilgo Beach. The police believed that the belt was handled by the perpetrator and that it had not belonged to any of the victims. That is just speculation at the moment, though. The police revealed a few details about the belt's evidentiary value and would not comment on exactly where it had been found, so they did keep a little bit back. It was also announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation and that they had launched gilgonews.com. And what gilgonews.com was, it was a website enabling the department to share news and receive tips regarding the investigation. So that's a pretty clever way of all the agencies getting the information at the same time. So the other thing that came up as the technology has progressed in the forensic field is the identification of remains through genetic genealogy. And I find this really interesting and such a helpful tool to the police. So in June of 2019, a proposal was made to use genetic genealogy to identify the unidentified victims and possibly the killer in the Gilgo Beach case. So on May 28, 2020, Jane Doe number 6 was in fact identified as Valerie Mack, who also went by the name of Melissa Taylor. So this is going to get a little bit confusing because she did have two aliases. So I think I'm just going to call her Melissa Taylor because that is the name that keeps coming up in my notes and research. So Valerie Mack and Melissa Taylor are the same person, but I'm just going to call her Melissa for the sake of argument and so we don't get confused. On August 4 of 2023, Jane Doe number 7 was revealed to be Karen Vergata, whose identity had been established during 2022. So only 2 years ago. Okay, so we're going to scoot back a little bit here. This case does go back and forward a little bit, so I'm going to try and keep it as clear for you guys as I can. So we're going to jump back to 2017, September 12. The Suffolk County prosecutor, Robert Biancavilla, said that John Bitrolf, a Suffolk County resident, who was also convicted of murdering 2 sex workers and suspected in the murder of a third, may have committed some of the Gilgo Beach murders. Biancavilla said that Bitrolf was likely responsible for the deaths of other women and that there were similarities between the Gilgo Beach crime scenes and Bitrolf's known murders and crime scenes. And he was convicted of those murders in May 2017 and sentenced in September of the same year. So when Bitrolf was actually arrested in 2014, after his DNA was found on the bodies of 2 murder victims, and these are not the Gilgo Beach victims, this is back to 2014 now, were 2 women named Rita Tancredi and Colleen McNamee, whose bodies were found in 1993 and 1994 respectively, so that's going back a little ways now. The match that had been made through DNA was submitted by his brother, who was convicted in 2013 on an unrelated case, and it doesn't say what his brother did. It was probably like a misdemeanor, something like that. So Bitrolf was convicted in May 2017 of these murders, and in September sentenced to consecutive terms of 25 years for each murder. The Suffolk County Police did not comment on the prosecutor's statement due to the active homicide investigation of the Gilgo Beach murders. Bitrolf's attorney rejected the prosecution's assertion. So this guy, Bitrolf, actually lived in Manorville, 30 miles or 48 kilometres from where the torsos of Gilgo Beach victims Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack were discovered. Bitrolf was a hunter, and it was said that he enjoyed killing animals. And as we've seen before, that's a serial killer trait. He was a carpenter by trade, and he had access to hacksaws and electric saws. And because many of the bodies were found precisely dismembered, his access to and proficiency of these tools was of note. However, I have to throw this in. You might have proficiency with saws and tools, but it does take another certain level of skill to actually, this is awful, and I hate that I actually know this, but in my younger years I did study forensic profiling. I also was interested in the medical field for a while, and I did do anatomy. And if you're going to dismember a body, be it a human body or the body of an animal or something like that, there is kind of a precise way to actually dismember limbs, etc. You have to cut through cartilage, bone, muscles, all that kind of thing. So unless you really know what you're doing, the results can be messy. I'm not going to go into it any further because ew. But it kind of sounds to me, as I've researched this case, that the body parts that the police did find were actually quite neatly cut and dismembered. It wasn't like they were in a mess. So, okay, he might be proficient with saws, but does he know how to dismember a body correctly? And I guess that is something you probably could get good at on your own if you wanted to. My God. But that puts just that little seed of doubt in my mind about Bitrolf, because, okay, he might be proficient with saws and tools, but does he know how to correctly disassemble a living body? So that's just an interesting little note that just kind of got my little seed of doubt going there. So in another interesting twist in the case, the adult daughter of Rita Tangretti, who was actually murdered by Bitrolf, was also the best friend of Melissa Barthélemy, one of the Gilgo Beach victims. Barthélemy's mother said that her daughter Melissa had a lot of calls from Manorville from her phone before her death. So that's another interesting little piece to this puzzle. So that's kind of where it runs dry on Bitrolf. And then we're going to jump forward to last year in July 2023. So this is when we get to where Rex Andrew Hewerman, born February 12, 1964, a 59-year-old Nassau County resident, was arrested in Midtown Manhattan and subsequently charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for 3 of the Gilgo Beach victims. And there was also 3 counts of a lesser charge of second-degree murder, and that was actually related to the deaths of Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman and Amber Costello. And he is also the prime suspect in the death of Maureen Brainard Barnes. Hewerman has pleaded not guilty to these charges, and Hewerman is an architect and has lived much of his life in Massapequa Park on Long Island. And there is an interview with him on YouTube, and Hewerman stated he has worked in Manhattan since 1987. So if I can find a bit of that interview, I'll drop it here, and I'll also drop the link to the full interview, because obviously this is somebody else's video and I don't want to post too much of it here because that's their work. But if I can find it, I'll pop a bit in here. If I feel like I shouldn't use it at all, I will definitely send you the link in the description so you guys can go watch it if you would like to watch it. So the authorities actually began to seriously consider Hewerman as a suspect in March 2022 after discovering that a Chevrolet Avalanche registered in his name had been linked to one of the killings by a witness. So the other thing that's just sort of gone off on the other side of my brain is the guy, this first guy, Bitrolf, was obviously a carpenter or whatever of some note. So, he, as I said before, he knew how to use saws and things. Hewerman's an architect. Did these 2 people know each other before the arrests? Because remember, they thought, okay, maybe it's just one person doing it. But they also, as the case progressed, began to think, was it 2 people? So the question in my mind is, you've got Hewerman on this side, you've got Bitrolf on this side. Bitrolf knew one of the victims, and then Hewerman knows that victim that he's killed, he's also linked to them. So my question is, did these 2 men know each other, and were they working together? That's a really interesting slant on the case. And as I said, this case is still active, it's still open, it's still being investigated. So if we do get any interesting tidbits or updates come to light, I will as always, update you guys. So also, according to investigators, his cell phone records indicate he had been in contact with not just one, but 3 of the 4 victims, and an email account linked to Herein where he had conducted online searches of the investigation process. So he's linked to 3 of the victims so far beforehand, and he's also been online doing some investigating of his own. So court records also indicated that he had searched the internet for sadistic materials, child pornography, and I hate saying that, and images of the victims and their relatives, all before the murders occurred. So mitochondrial DNA testing, or mtDNA testing, also indicated Herein as a potential match when hair found on the burlap wrappings of one of the bodies was compared to a sample gleaned from a pizza crust, and this is so clever of the police, in a box he had discarded. There was also a potential match to Heurein's wife, and that was found when comparing hair found on or near 3 of the victims to samples taken from bottles found in the trash outside the Herein residence. Investigators did state that his wife and children were out of the state at the time during which the killings were believed to have occurred. But that being said, the DNA of his wife turning up on one of the bodies is pretty easily explained. If they were transported in his car, they could have bumped up against something she's touched, or, he might have had a piece of her hair on his clothing and it's got onto the victim. So this is how they actually catch these people. It's by really little insignificant things like that. So it doesn't mean his wife was involved or that she's guilty at all. And as they've said, she wasn't even there when these things happened. But if she got on him and then he's done what he's done and that little piece of his wife has ended up on one of the victims, it puts him square in the crosshairs of the police. So it is very, very tricky and clever, the little things that actually get people arrested for the crimes they commit. And that's one of the parts of the cases that I really love, is like these little insignificant things that you wouldn't even pay attention to that actually break these cases wide open. So there were also several reports of alarming encounters with other people and Herein. So there were a lot of individuals who had somewhat alarming encounters with Herein, and they shared their experiences with him after his arrest. So the first comes from a lady named Merle Henrique, who worked for him, and said in 2007 he gave her a sweater his wife, Asa, brought back from a trip to Iceland. Somewhat unnerving though, he asked her details about a cruise that she was taking. She declined to be specific. I think she was kind of feeling a little bit uncomfortable. And she goes, "Oh, you're not going to find me in the middle of the ocean." To which he replied, "Oh, yes, I can." And this is really creepy. On the second day of her trip, she found an envelope with a note from him under her door that read, "I told you that I could find you anywhere." I'd be leaving for the moon at that point. So another woman, Nikki Brass, a former escort, had an unsettling dinner with him about 8 years before his arrest. He initiated a conversation about the Gilgo Beach murders, which had been recently discovered. Her recall of the meeting was he was not discussing the murders as a crime bar for an interested member of the community, but rather in a more personal way. She consequently arranged for a friend to meet her outside the restaurant, declining his offer of a ride home. And I think that was pretty smart of her, considering what he was arrested for. A neighbour, Jimmy Mack, described a worrisome confrontation with Herein, who had stopped outside Mack's home because a truck was parked partially on the sidewalk. And he would watch Herein take to describing the situation aloud to himself. So Max kind of walked over and said, and he's approached him to see what was going on, and Herein said, Oh, I told you guys before. Now I'm going to slash the tyres on that truck. And then on the other hand, another woman, Catherine Shepherd, who had an occasion to share an office with him, said that after she had slipped on ice and hurt herself, he was very caring and attentive to her. Didn't stay that way though. 2 years later, he recruited her to measure his basement with him. He warned her to keep away from a room where he kept saying there was a bunch of guns inside it. And this is horrifying what the police uncover in this home. When the police searched the home after his arrest, they found 279 weapons there. More than 90 did have permits, but there were dozens of unregistered pistols and assault weapons. So that sort of brings to mind more worrying thoughts. All right, why did he need so many guns? Because if he was, in fact, one of the Gilgo Beach serial killers, they were not killing these women with guns. They were, well, it seems to be they were strangling them or stabbing them or whatever they were doing, and then they were dismembering these ladies. So he wasn't collecting guns to commit murder with. And why would you need such a big arsenal? Was he planning something bigger? And the police interest in him for the Gilgo Beach killings stopped him from going further with whatever he was planning. So that's worrying to think of, why did he have such a huge arsenal at his disposal? What could you possibly need that for? So that was a very interesting twist as well. So the research now that I have followed progresses into the actual victims that he has been charged with murdering, and that is the Gilgo Four. And there's a lot of information in this case, so I'm just going to remind you guys of where we're at as we progress with it. So the Gilgo Four, they are the victims who were discovered in December of 2010. And we're going to start with Maureen Brainard Barnes. So Maureen Brainard Barnes was of Norwich, Connecticut. She was only 25 years old when she disappeared. She was last seen on July 9 of 2007, saying that she planned to spend the day in New York City. Maureen was never seen again. And Maureen was a mother of two, and she had to work as a sex worker via Craigslist to pay for the mortgage on her house. So I'm guessing she may also have been a single mum. She had been out of the sex industry for 7 months, but she returned to the work in order to pay her bills, and this was after she received an eviction notice. Her body was found in December 2010, as we said before. So this lady's had obviously quite the sad life, and then she's met this terrible ending. So shortly after her disappearance, a friend of Maureen's, Sarah Carnes, receives a phone call from a man on an unfamiliar number. The man claimed that he had just seen Maureen and that she was alive and staying at a whorehouse in Queens. He refused to identify himself and could not tell Carnes the location of said house. He told Carnes he would call back and give her the address, but he never did call her again. She'd also go on to say that the man had no discernible New York, Boston or Maine accent, which is common for that area. So it may have been a good thing for Carnes that this man never contacted her again, because can you imagine, he could have easily lured her away and proceeded. So at the time of her disappearance, Maureen was working at a Super 8 motel in Manhattan. On the night of July 9, 2007, she called a friend in Connecticut and told her that she was planning on meeting a client outside the motel. Like many of the victims, Brainard Barnes was very petite. She was a tiny lady. She was only 4'11", and she was 105 pounds, which is a low 48 kilo in Australian terms. Melissa Bartholomew is our next one. So Melissa was only 24, of Erie County, New York, and she went missing on July 12 of 2009. She had been living in the Bronx in New York, and she was also working as a sex worker, also through Craigslist. On the night she went missing, she met with a client and deposited $900 into her bank account. She also attempted to call an old boyfriend, but did not get through. And because she didn't get through, we don't know why she was trying to call her old boyfriend. Maybe she needed help and she couldn't find anybody. So beginning 1 week later and lasting for 5 weeks, her teenage sister Amanda starts to receive a series of vulgar, mocking and insulting calls from a man who may have been the killer, and he was using her sister's cell phone. The caller would ask 16-year-old Amanda, was she a whore like her sister? And that would have been so absolutely terrifying for a child of that age. The calls became increasingly disturbing and eventually culminated in the caller telling Amanda that her sister was dead and that he was going to watch her rot. This guy is just pure evil. Police traced some of the calls to Madison Square Garden in Midtown Manhattan and Massapequa, and if you remember, that is where Hewerman is from Massapequa. But were unable to determine who was actually making the calls at the time. Barthelomew's mother noted that there were a lot of calls to Manorville from her daughter's phone around the time of her disappearance. In September of 2017, a prosecutor suggested John Bitroff, this is the carpenter from that town convicted of 2 other murders, might be responsible for some of the Gilgo Beach cases. And Bartholomew, again, was a very tiny in stature person. She was only 4'10" and 95 pounds, which is only 43 kilos. She was very, very small. We move on now to Megan Waterman. Megan Waterman was only 22 and of South Portland, Maine, when she went missing on the 6th of June 2010. She also placed advertisements on Craigslist as an escort. The previous day, she told her 20-year-old boyfriend that she was going out and that she would call him later. At the time of her disappearance, she was staying at a motel in Hauppauge, New York, 15 miles northeast of Gilgo Beach. Her body was recovered in December of 2010. Waterman was the mother of 1 and had become a victim of sex trafficking. Waterman was 5'5" and doesn't actually say how much she weighed, but if she's only 5'5", I'd imagine she probably was on the lighter side like the other ladies. Amber Lynn Costello. Amber Lynn Costello was only 27 years old, of West Babylon, New York, a small town 10 miles north of Gilgo Beach, when she went missing. She was also a sex worker and she was a heroin user, and she went missing on September 2, 2010. The night she reportedly went missing, she went to meet a stranger who had called her several times and offered her $1,500 for her services. Born in Charlotte and raised in Wilmington, North Carolina, Costello was living in West Babylon when she disappeared. Her family believed that she was in a residential drug rehabilitation center, so the alarm bells didn't go off immediately, and because they thought she was somewhere else, and she was not immediately reported missing. She was reported missing when she stopped responding to messages and phone calls. So prior moving to West Babylon, Costello had been living with her second husband in Clearwater, Florida, and she was working as a waitress while she was there. She was actually a strong student when she was, attending classes and such, and her drug addiction began when she was just a teenager. We think it was because she had been sexually assaulted by a neighbour when she was only 6 years old. Costello was also very tiny. She was 4'11" and approximately only 45 kilos, which is about 100 pounds. So that's another tiny, tiny woman. There were additional victims discovered in March and April. 4 more sets of remains were discovered on March 29 and April 4 of 2011. All of these remains were found in another area off the parkway near Oak Beach and Gilgo Beach, within 2 miles and to the east of those that were found in December of 2010. The newly discovered victims were Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, an unidentified woman designated Jane Doe number 3, and I did mention her before, or Peaches, because of her tattoo, and an unidentified toddler who was the daughter of Peaches. Suffolk Police subsequently expanded the search area up to Nassau County and to the border of Nassau County, looking for more victims. And unfortunately, the police were not disappointed in this search. 2 further sets of remains were discovered on April 11, 2011, after the search expanded into Nassau County. They were found about 1 mile apart, approximately 5 miles west of those found in December. One set of remains belonged to a victim who is now thought to be a transgender woman, though he, she, sorry, I get confused with the pronouns, they were actually designated as Asian male. Police said the victim had been dead for between 5 to 10 years. The other remains were those of Jane Doe number 7, whose partial remains had been discovered on Fire Island in 1996. So the remains that were identified, and I did touch on this before, but it goes into it now in greater detail. So I'm sorry if this case does get a little bit confusing. I'm trying to make it as clear for you guys as I can. So these are the women that were the Gilgo Beach, that were after the Gilgo Beach 4. These were the next set of victims. And this is where it gets confusing. So if you remember, Valerie Mack / Melissa Taylor, we're just going to call her Melissa, is the first one that we cover in this part of the case. So these are the subsequent victims. These are not the Gilgo 4. So Melissa Taylor, who was known as the Manaville Jane Doe or Jane Doe number 6, was living in Philadelphia, and she was working as an escort when she went missing in 2006. It's not clear if she was listed on Craigslist at the time. Like many of the victims, she was small in stature, approximately 5 feet, and weighing approximately 100 pounds. As we said before, it's only 45 kilo. Melissa's partial remains were discovered in Manaville on November 19, 2000, but they were not identified, as we touched on earlier, until 2020. And it gets into a description of how she was found, so just be ready, it's nasty. Her torso was found wrapped in garbage bags and dumped in the woods near the intersection of Halsey Manor Road and Mill Road. And this was adjacent to a set of power lines and a nearby power line access road. This is so sick. A head, a right foot, and hands were found on April 4, 2011, and they were at first determined to have belonged to an unidentified victim, as we said before, Jane Doe number 6. It was later determined that they belonged to the same woman whose torso had been found in 2000. As we said before, that was Melissa. Her right foot had been cut off high above the ankle, possibly to conceal an identifying mark or a tattoo. On May 28, 2020, police announced that the remains had been identified as Melissa Taylor, who had last been seen by family members in the spring or summer of 2000 in the area of Port Republic, New Jersey. So just to add to the confusion, we have another victim, and she is actually Jessica Taylor. She's not Melissa. She's another victim. Just so we don't get confused as this goes along, because I just had a moment of confusion. So the dismembered remains of Valerie Mack and a separate woman. So Melissa Taylor and Valerie Mack, as we said before, are the same person. Another lady named Jessica Taylor, who they also found was disposed of in a similar manner to Melissa and in the same part of Manaville, suggesting a link. And I think it's weird that, like, Valerie Mack changed her name to Melissa Taylor, and then you've got a girl named Jessica Taylor who's also a victim. That's weird to me. That's very weird. So Did maybe the killer think that these two ladies were related? Did he think he was killing a pair of sisters? I mean, it just makes you wonder what the heck was going on here. And if anybody is getting perplexed as I'm going along, I don't blame you. This is a very twisted up case. But it kind of all comes together in the end. So now we move on to Jessica Taylor, not to be confused with Melissa. So Jessica Taylor was a 20-year-old woman who was living in Manhattan when she went missing on July 21 of 2003. On July 26 of 2003, her naked and dismembered torso, missing its head and hands, was discovered 45 miles or 72 kilometres each of Gilgo Beach in Manaville. These remains were identified by DNA analysis later that year. Taylor's torso was found atop a pile of scrap wood at the end of a paved access road off Halsey Manor Road, again, just north of where it crosses the Long Island Expressway. Plastic sheeting was found underneath the torso, and a tattoo on her body had been mutilated with a sharp instrument, and that would be to make identifying who owned the torso even more difficult, as they speculated with Melissa as to where her leg had been amputated by the killer. It was up pretty far on her ankle, so maybe that he was trying to get rid of a tattoo with her as well. So further remains found on March 29, 2011 was a match to Jessica, including a skull, a pair of hands and a forearm. She had worked in Washington, D.C. and Manhattan as a sex worker. Jessica was last seen working around the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan between July 18 and 22, 2003. Now we move on to Karen Vergata. And as you might remember, we mentioned her earlier. She was actually the Fire Island Jane Doe, or also Jane Doe number 7. So Karen Vergata, a 34-year-old woman from Manhattan, was believed to have been working as a sex worker when she disappeared back in 1996. She was unidentified for 27 years. Karen Vergata was variously known as Jane Doe number 7, as we just said, or the Fire Island Jane Doe, until she was publicly identified by Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney in August of just last year. And she had actually been identified in 2022, but the announcement was only made last year. And she was identified, if you remember, through the genetic genealogy. Vergata's severed legs were found in a garbage bag on Fire Island on April 20, 1996. 15 years later, on April 11, 2011, her skull and several of her teeth were recovered at Tobay Beach, the second set of remains to be discovered in Nassau County that day. These remains were linked through DNA testing to the remains found on Fire Island in 1996. So whoever was killing these women, he really didn't want them to be identified at all. Okay, so this brings us to the three, probably the ones that pull at my heartstrings the most in this case. The three victims that remain unidentified to this day: Peaches, Baby Doe and Asian male. Peaches had been identified through DNA testing as the mother of Baby Doe, but nobody knows who she actually is. So Peaches, or Jane Doe number 3, was found on June 28, 1997, and what was found of Peaches was a dismembered torso, and she was unidentified, and she was a young African-American woman, and she was found at Hempstead Lake State Park in the town of Lakeview, New York. The torso, this is absolutely horrid. The torso was found in a green plastic Rubbermaid container, which was dumped next to a road along the west side of the lake. Honestly, I've covered some pretty depraved monsters on this channel, but the utter disrespect that this... I never have a bad enough word for this guy, that this guy is paying to his victims. Like, he's chopping them up, and he's just discarding them like they're garbage. I mean, and he did it to all of them, but just how he's put her in a container and just dumped her, and he didn't have the decency to at least keep her with her child that obviously he's also killed. Oh, this... Ugh. I'm just going to say it, I hate this dude. He is a piece of work. I really hope he gets caught. So the investigators reported that the victim had a tattoo on her left breast of a heart-shaped peach with a bite out of it and 2 drips falling from its core. So, if anybody, I'm just going to say this, if anybody watching this program is from the US, and you know, maybe you had a friend you went to high school with and you haven't heard from in a while and it hasn't hit you yet, or just, does anybody know who this lady is? She's a young African-American woman. She had a little girl and she had this very distinctive tattoo on her chest of these peaches. If you even have an inkling of who she might be, please get in touch with the FBI or the police in Long Island and just say, oh look, I think this girl might be such and such. And if it turns out to not be her, well, okay. But, you know, these poor people, they need to be laid to rest properly. They need to be given a name. And a child needs to be given a name. And the same with the young Asian person that may have been identifying as transgender. These people all had families once. They all had people who loved them. You know, somebody's got to be missing these people. So if you know who they are, you can remain anonymous. Please speak up and at least identify them. Please. They deserve that much. So on April 11, 2011, police in Nassau County discovered dismembered skeletal human remains inside a plastic bag near the Jones Beach State Park. The victim, dubbed Jane Doe number 3, or as Peaches, as we just said, were positively identified through DNA testing as being the same person. DNA analysis also identified Peaches as the mother of baby Doe. She was found wearing gold jewellery similar to that of her daughter. And if you guys have been watching me for a while, this is the part I struggle with most, is when children, elderly people, animals, all of it hits me. I mean, don't think I don't care about adults who have been taken by killers, but most vulnerable in our communities. And I always struggle with having to talk about what's happened to children, but I'm going to do my best because this really hits me in the feels. Baby Doe. A third set of remains, the skeleton of a female toddler between 16 and 24 months of age, or by another account she may have even been as old as 4 years old, was found on April 4, 2011, about 250 feet or 80 metres away from the partial remains of Melissa Taylor. The body was wrapped in a blanket and showed no visible signs of trauma. DNA testing determined that the child's mother was Jane Doe number 3, or Peaches, whose body was found 10 miles, 16 kilometres east near Jones Beach State Park. The toddler was wearing gold earrings and a gold necklace. Oh boy. So now we move on to the body that was just identified as an Asian male. The body of a young Asian male who had died from blunt force trauma was also discovered on April 4, 2011 at Gilgo Beach, very close to where the first 4 sets of remains had been discovered in December of 2010. This victim was found wearing women's clothing and may possibly have been identifying as transgender female. The victim was between 17 and 23 years of age, 5'6", which is about 1.6 metres in height. They were also missing 4 teeth and may have also been suffering a musculoskeletal disorder, which could have affected their gait, which means they may have a very distinctive way they walked. The victim had been dead between 5 and 10 years at this point. In September 2011, police released a male composite sketch of the victim, and if I can find that sketch, I will pop it in here so you guys can see. And again, if anybody knows who they are, please get in touch with the authorities. So now we are going to focus on Shannon Gilbert, and it was a search for her that opened this case wide up. Even though it gets to a point in the case where the police don't believe that she was a victim of the Gilgo Beach killer. So on December 13 of 2011, police announced that the remains of Shannon Gilbert had finally been found in a marsh about a half a mile from where she had disappeared. A week earlier, some of her clothing and belongings had been discovered in the same vicinity. Gilbert was last seen banging on a resident's door and screaming for help before running off into the night. Gilbert had also made an emergency 911 call that night, saying that she feared for her life. Police have stated that the death of Gilbert, a woman whose disappearance triggered the search during which the first set of bodies was found, seems to be unrelated to the Long Island serial killer case. At this stage, Gilbert's now deceased mother, Mari Gilbert, advocated for the theory that her daughter had in fact been murdered by a serial killer. It may not have been the same person, but her mother did believe that she could have been killed by a serial killer. So, as the case progressed, more of the remains were identified. So we have a woman named Tina Elizabeth Foglia. She was 19 years old and she was last seen alive in the early morning hours of February 1st. And this goes back a long way, 1982. And she was at the Hammerheads rock music venue on Sunrise Highway in West Islip. And she had hitchhiked from her home to the venue to see a friend performing with a Queens-based band called Equinox. Her remains were discovered by Department of Transport workers on February 3 on the shoulder of the Sagittacus State Parkway in Suffolk County. Her body also had been dismembered and had been placed in 3 separate plastic garbage bags. And it was found a few miles north of the Robert Moses Causeway, which leads, as we've all known, as we've progressed in this case, to Gilgo and Oak Beach. A diamond ring that Foglia was known to wear was missing, and the DNA of an unknown male was found on the garbage bags. The police have not ruled out the possibility that Tina Foglia may have been an early victim of the Long Island serial killer, but have stated that a connection is not an active avenue of the investigation. Then we move on to yet another victim, Jacqueline Ashley Smith. Jackie was only 16 when she was last seen in Brooklyn, New York in August of 1999, and the day that she was actually last seen was August 7. Jackie had left her home at 9 p.m. to visit friends, and she never returned. She was reported missing on August 12 of 1999. On June 20, 2000, an unidentified female torso was recovered near Beach 88th Street in Rockaway Beach, Queens. The torso was found in plastic garbage bags and wrapped with tape. No other body parts of Jackie were recovered. The victim was later identified as Jacqueline Smith, or Jackie. 2 years later, the torso of Andre Isaac was also recovered in Rockaway, not far from where Smith was found. And Andre Jamal Isaac is saying, but hang on, that's a guy's name. Another twist. Andre Isaac was actually a professional drag queen, and a lot of people may even be familiar with him. His stage name was Sugar Bear, and I'm sure there has been like a separate investigation into Sugar Bear's death. He was 6'5" tall and was 25 years old when he disappeared from East New York in November of 2002. According to a friend, Isaac was last seen shortly before Thanksgiving, or Sugar Bear as he was known, getting into a car with a secret friend. The vehicle was described as a red BMW type coupe driven by a Hispanic male. Isaac's torso was found close to the boardwalk on Beach 63rd Street in Auvergne, Queens, on December 17, 2002. On January 25, 2003, his head was discovered by ice skaters in East Mill Pond in Mauritius, New York, in Suffolk County. What a horrible find for them. I can't even imagine finding something like that. With a single bullet wound to his temple, his arms and legs were later found several miles away in plastic bags. Isaac's case was added to the Suffolk County Police Department to the Gilgo News website on May 29 of 2020. Another victim also identified was Jamie Diane Seymour. Jamie Seymour was only 21 years old when she was last heard from in Brick, New Jersey on July 22, 2005. She called her father on July 22 to let him know she needed a ride home from the Port Authority. Seymour used someone else's phone at the Manhattan Port Authority to call her mother later that day. She was not seen or heard from since. After her final phone call to her mother, when 2 weeks passed and no one heard from Seymour, her father became worried. On August 8, her father reported her missing to the police. Seymour spent time prior to her disappearance in New York City, and she did also have a criminal record. There have been few leads in Seymour's case, and her family believes that she did meet with foul play. Police have never indicated any connection between Seymour's disappearance and the Long Island serial killer. However, Seymour was a young woman with a small frame, and that was characteristics of other victims of the Long Island serial killer. She vanished in July, similar to victims Melissa Barthélemy, Maureen Brainard Barnes, and Jessica Taylor. Seymour was also last seen at the same places as Jessica Taylor, the Port Authority bus station in Midtown. So they're saying they don't think she was one of the victims of the Long Island serial killer, but there's too many connections. So I think, yeah, she possibly could have been. Another victim was Tanya Rush. On June 23, 2008, Tanya Rush, 39, was last seen around 3 a.m. She was walking towards a subway station in Brooklyn. Her dismembered body was found by a State Road cleaning crew inside a black canvas suitcase on June 27, 2008, and this black canvas suitcase was in plain sight on the Newbridge Road ramp leading to westbound Southern State Parkway in Belmore, New York. Rush was the mother of 3, and she had actually been a Salvation Army volunteer and had worked in telemarketing. She was another woman who was a victim of circumstance, and she had to take up sex work to support a drug addiction. Rush was also an African American and lived in the Van Dyke Houses, a Brownsville public housing complex in Brooklyn, New York. So it seems to be that a lot of these ladies were actually down on their luck when they were potentially killed by this serial killer. And we move on to our girl, Shannon Maria Gilbert. Shannon was only 24 and was working as an escort who may have been a victim of the Long Island serial killer. She left for a client's residence in Oak Beach after midnight on May 1, 2010. At 4:51 in the morning, 911 dispatchers received a panic phone call from Gilbert, who could be heard saying that there was someone after her and that they were trying to kill her. She was last seen a short time later banging on a front door of a nearby Oak Beach residence and screaming for help before running off into the night. After 19 months of searching, police found Gilbert's remains in a marsh half a mile from where she was last seen. In May of 2012, the Suffolk County Medical Examiners ruled that Gilbert, as we explored before, they ruled that she had accidentally drowned after entering the marsh. They also believed that Shannon may have been in a drug-induced panic and have concluded that, for now, I'll say, that her death was a death by misadventure or inconclusive. Her family, however, believes that she was murdered. On November 15 of 2012, a lawsuit was filed by her mother, Mari Gilbert, against the Suffolk County Police Department in the hopes of getting more answers about what in fact happened to her daughter, Shannon, the night she went missing. Due to controversy about Shannon's death in September 2014, forensic pathologist Michael Baden agreed to conduct an independent autopsy of Shannon's remains in hopes of determining a clear cause of death. Upon examination of Shannon, Baden found damage to her hyoid bone, and that's this little bone in your neck that actually breaks if you've been choked or throttled or strangled. And that suggested to him that strangulation may have occurred. Baden also noted that her body was found face up, which is not common for drowning victims. Despite this, her death is still officially listed as an accident. And this is the next horrible twist in this case. And this really hits me hard as well, and it did when I watched the movie about what happened to Shannon. So on the 23rd of July 2016, Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, was actually murdered in her home in Ellenville, New York. Later that day, her younger daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Gilbert, was arrested and charged with stabbing her mother to death. See, like I said, this case has got a lot of horrible twists and turns. On May 6, 2020, the New York Supreme Court ordered Suffolk County Police to release Gilbert's 911 recording, denying their request to withhold it after more than 10 years. On May 13, 2022, the Suffolk County Police Department released the 911 call, and if I can find it, I will drop it in here somewhere.
What's your name?
Shannon Gilbert.
Where are you?
I'm in Long Island.
And what's wrong?
Huh?
What happened?
These people are plotting to kill me.
It's clear from the newly released 911 calls that Shannon Gilbert thought she was going to be killed that night on May 1st, 2010.
No, stop it, please. Stop it, please. Please stop it. Please stop it. No, please stop it.
Gilbert, a sex worker, was at the house of a man named Joseph Brewer in Ocean Beach.
At some point during the meeting with Brewer, Shannon reportedly began acting irrational. This prompted Brewer to contact Michael Pack, who was outside in his driveway.
Pack was Gilbert's bodyguard.
Julie, how are you upstairs? Okay? Julie, please. Please, take care. Mari, hold. Mari, what's the matter? Are you okay?
What are you going to do? What are you going to do to me?
After that, we can hear Gilbert running outside. She starts knocking on people's doors.
Don't keep yourself hurt. Where are you going?
Gilbert takes off running again, and this is the last thing we hear on the call released by police. Police believe Gilbert ran into the marsh in Gilgo, which would have looked like this, they say.
The prevailing opinion in Shannon's death, while tragic, was not a murder and was most likely non-criminal.
Longtime Gilbert family attorney John Ray says he still believes Gilbert was murdered.
Shannon Gilbert had a hyoid bone that is a horn-shaped bone in your throat that if you break it, you suffocate. The horns were broken.
Then we move on past poor Shannon and her mother to yet another lady. Her name was Natasha Dugo, and she was 31 when she was last seen leaving her Queens Village, New York home on March 16 of 2013. And she was seen leaving her home at about 4:30 a.m. The following day, her wallet, her ID and some clothing were discovered abandoned along Ocean Parkway, close to Gilgo Beach. Dugo's 2009 Toyota Prius was also found abandoned near the beach with footprints in the sand leading towards the water. Dugo's body was eventually discovered floating in the water by beachgoers at 9:30 p.m. on the 24th of June 2013. Dugo's body was the 11th human body to be found at Gilgo Beach since December 2010, and her body actually showed no obvious signs of trauma. So, in the case of this lady, my speculation and everything else we've seen of this case, it seems that her death would be more likely to be maybe a death by misadventure or a death by unaliving herself. I actually don't think this lady was a part of the serial killings, but I mean, who knows? She could have ran into the water to try and escape someone. I mean, that's happened before. And maybe she stayed in the water too long and she drowned. It doesn't actually say, like, the results of her autopsy, was water found in her lungs or was it not? So that would sort of bring a little bit more clarity. If water was found in her lungs, yeah, it may be a drowning. If it's not, it may be something more sinister. We move on, again, to yet another victim. A 42-year-old mother of two named Patricia Viola, and she was from Bogota, New Jersey. She was also described as a 5'2" brunette, very petite, and she vanished on February 13, 2001. Her partial remains were found from Rockaway Beach, Queens, in July 2002. Her body was not identified until 2012. The New Jersey Patricia's Law, which bars police from refusing to accept missing persons reports and requires them to notify a missing person's family of support services, is named after Patricia Viola. And we have yet another unidentified victim, and in another horrible twist, this victim was also named for a fruit tattoo that was found on her body. So, called Cherries, an unidentified woman was found on March 3, 2007 in a suitcase, and it contained her torso, and it is believed that she was a Hispanic or light-skinned African-American woman. And this washed up on a beach at Harbour Island in the town of Mamaroneck. The victim had a tattoo of two cherries on her left breast, very similar in appearance to the tattoo found on Peaches, but instead of peaches, it was cherries. She was determined to have been stabbed to death. Never identified, the victim is referred to as Cherries by the investigators. One of her dismembered legs washed up at Cold Spring Harbour on March 21, 2007, and the other at Oyster Bay in the village of Cove Neck the following day. Cherries was dismembered in a similar fashion to the other three victims, Jessica Taylor, Melissa Taylor, and Peaches, meaning she may be linked to the other official victims. We have yet another unidentified victim, and this was from Laddingtown. On January 23, 2013, a lady walking her dog found human remains in a small patch of brush in a sandy area along the shore at the edge of Sheep Lane in Laddingtown, near Oyster Bay. The skeletal remains showed signs of trauma and were wrapped in a particular type of material. Now, the police have not disclosed what this particular type of material was. So they're obviously holding that evidence back to keep its evidentiary value. The remains are believed to be those of a woman between the ages of 20 to 30 who is possibly Asian. She was found wearing a 22-carat solid gold pig pendant, to which the investigators think may be related to the Chinese zodiac, the year of the pig. And this is important because the relative birth years are 1971, 1983 and 1995, possibly suggesting that the woman died at the age of 29. Investigators believed that her body had been dumped before Hurricane Sandy in late 2012. Her case may be connected to the other 10 bodies found 32 miles or 51 kilometres away in and around Gilgo Beach. Though, unlike the other victims, her body was buried rather than left above ground. So that's another interesting twist. So a profile of the killer has been speculated upon. The media had speculated about a profile of the killer referred to by police as Joe C., unknown subject. According to the New York Times, the perpetrator was most likely a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s with very familiar with the South Shore of Long Island, and that he would also have had access to burlap sacks used to hold and dispose of the bodies. He may have had a detailed knowledge of law enforcement techniques, perhaps ties to law enforcement, which have thus far helped him to avoid detection. Because remember, somebody is still out there that's killed all of these other people. Heuermann's only been arrested for 4 of the cases. According to investigators, as I've just explored, there may be more than one killer, and I'm leaning towards that myself. And that finally is where we leave today's extremely horrific case of the Long Island serial killer or killers. So let me know your thoughts and theories in the comments section below, what you thought of today's case. Do you live in the area if you're overseas, if you're actually in the US? Do you remember hearing about this as it came up? I'd be interested to know whatever anybody has to share with this case. Also, if anybody thinks that I may have got something wrong while I'm doing this, please keep in mind, as the disclaimer that I put at the start of all my videos does say, I get my information from news and historical sites. I don't make any of it up. I'm simply relaying what I found in my research. But if you think the police have missed something or that the media have missed something, maybe now is the time for you to speak up about it. So I would also love to hear what you think of today's case. Anything that you think might help the investigators would be helpful. I'd also love to hear, as I said before, any suggestions of future cases that you'd like me to cover here on the channel. I'm always interested to know what you guys might like me to cover next. So please leave a comment and I'll do my best to make the case you'd like to hear about happen for you. And once again, as always, thank you all so much for being here. I love and appreciate you all so much, because without you, there's no me. And always, guys, please stay safe until we meet again. And I'll be seeing you all again very soon in my next video. Bye for now.